Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Folks, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Pat Flynn. I am joined by the one, the only, the mighty, and the magnificent Big Pete Groehler. Thank you for joining me, my friend.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
And we are sitting in a very chilly, cold dungeon of a basement. I've got a warming glass of wine. Pete, where's your drink?
I'm good for right now.
Left it upstairs. Let's talk about why religion is important and why any attempts to get away from religion are not only ultimately futile, I believe, but counterproductive in many respects. So you down for this conversation, Pete?
Yeah, I think it's one worth having, especially because, arguments could be made that because of a lack of religion, we have really gotten away from a lot of the principles of things like a moral populace in government or kind of the guiding light that's going to take us through this quagmire that we're kind of facing nowadays.
Yeah, quagmire is a gentle conservative way of putting it. I would say it's far worse than a quagmire. But let's back it up a little bit. Pete, for people who might be unfamiliar with our history, is we go way back.
We do.
We go back to the 8th grade, and we both had interesting stories in the sense that, we met in a private Catholic school. I would not have considered myself religious at that time. It's just where I ended up, and I spent a very good amount of time away from and even inclined against religion for many years after that, before my reversion experience. And you didn't seem to get so far away as I did, but you did have to go through a sort of, what would you call, like a re-authentication process?
Maybe more of like a reawakening, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
For me especially, I kind of fell into the trappings of, I can come to my own understanding of God without necessarily being a religious person. And that was kind of, where I started to kind of fall off after high school, I should say. Me and Pat went to separate high schools. I continued parochially in a private school where Pat kind of headed towards the route of a public school.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of after high school, I kind of saw the trappings of the world kind of creeping into parochial education, even in high school.
Is that so?
Yeah, because of course, the old
when I was just entrapped in the vermin slime of public school, like everything was, and I wasn't religious at the time, but I knew like whatever truth is, these multiple, like these 13 to 15 different jumbling philosophies that all these teachers are trying to press in on us at once, like they can't all be right.
Right. And there's argument too that it has to start young now, because then we don't know really anything else. And we've talked on this before with education and how these kind of things are beginning to creep in, even in the parochial schools, even like I mentioned before, the question of you're on a cruise ship and it's going down and you're drowning, and the whole dog is your best friend versus someone else that's drowning, and 95% of the kids picking the dog is a little bit frightening in that regard. And here I am over in the corner, my mother has been staunchly pro-life her whole life and has always put us in the realm of, human life is more sacred than anything else. I'm over here in the corner, curling, looking for my blankie, so to speak. And, and then I got to college and, I was and you could even agree with this point too, having gone back to take that one class, you know, even being on campus, you kind of need to keep your beliefs to yourself in a little bit of a regard.
Yeah, see, I've never had that problem, Pete. I don't think I've ever been able to
You've always been somewhat of an abrasive personality, though, too.
Yeah, but I know exactly what you mean. You know, the good thing is I think very early on I developed a mild skepticism of authority, especially in any type of academic setting.
Right.
And I think that that served me fairly well, because it taught me from a very early age to raise objections and to challenge certain authority figures. And I've clearly never lost that habit since.
Right.
And it's good, because it's not only helpful to me to see where are their arguments solid, where can they actually back up these assertions that they're launching, but after I took the class with Professor Nutbrain, the moral relativist, and I gave my final presentation at the end in defense of moral realism, and I thought it was of course I'd be the last person to deny this, but I thought it was an excellent rebuke of relativism, if I might say so. The students thanked me. They came up and they personally thanked me and said that I cleared up a tremendous amount of confusion for them that the class threw in their face of all these things that they thought were right and wrong, and this professor throwing out all this obscure postmodernism claptrap. So they essentially paid whatever $1,000, $3,000, whatever the cost of tuition was, to just be deeply confused for about a month, and then finally have me come up and say, no, everything that you intuited was actually correct, and here's why. Thanks for wasting your time.
Right.
Have a good rest of your.
It's like that movie they put out, God is Dead. The professor is the one arguing with the kid that says, God is dead, Nietzsche's classic argument. And the kid said, no, that's wrong. And I'm going to prove it to you. Yeah.
Except for I would like to think that it was even more absurd and better positioned for me, the theist. I mean, here was a woman that was a through and through postmodernist, does not believe in any sense of objectivity with regards to truth or relativism, but then will turn around at every single second and condemn certain people or classes or behaviors as wrong and try and uphold other positions as right. So you just have this incessant series of performance contradictions by Professor Nutbrain. Right. On one hand, she professes that there are no objective truths, which of course we know is classically self-refuting, because you're at least professing one. Of course it's there.
Right.
And then number two, that all morals are relative, but for some reason her morals are right.
Right.
Like, give me a break. So of course, the entire semester I was just calling her out on these things, and it agitated her somewhat. But I've never been over much concerned with agitating people. I think that there's some type of faculty in me where that sympathy has been removed. But it's just, I feel, I'm joking somewhat, but I really did feel a deep moral obligation to speak up in this class. I felt absolutely compelled to argue against this woman, to fight against the onslaught of postmodernist propaganda, literally propaganda that was not supported by any rigor whatsoever. It was just baseless assertion after baseless assertion, contradiction after contradiction, just being piled upon these students who, most of them weren't even interested in philosophy, were just filling a prerequisite. They didn't even care. So they were just taking it. They were just taking it in unquestioningly. Right? So who knows? Maybe some of them would have written it off as nonsense and gone on with their lives. But I don't know. All I could think of is, like, if I don't argue against this stuff, who knows what kind of mindset these kids will leave this classroom with.
Yeah, and you're in a very low percentile of people that feel that they need to talk up about this. And, like I was going to go towards with the movie God is Dead. I mean, you could,
which I've never seen, by the way. Is it decent?
It's all right.
It seemed a little hokey. So
they made a second one, and it was even more hokier than the first one.
Yeah.
But to kind of go along with that premise, we're kind of arguing a substantially subpar film. to go along with that point, I'm sure when you were up there, you kind of looked around the room and just looked at the mind numb on the faces of a lot of the people that have been taking this at face value, for, the semester or however long this class was. And they had been trained to think that way from the very beginning. We're starting to put this into kids younger and younger. And I've listened to Dr. Duke Pesta talks about this around the nation, and maybe some of our listeners have had the pleasure of hearing him talk on the ills of Common Core and government education, and that kids, you used to be able to trust that the teachers that you were dropping your kids off with for 6 or 7 hours a day were actually going to, help in assisting you to raise these kids in a way that was productive, pushing them out into society, giving them a good base of values, helping to socialize them with other children.
Yes.
And they're just constantly pushing this message. I mean, Dr. Duke brings it up too, and he has a concrete example of a book that's being read to third graders about, how all bodies are beautiful. And it literally has, it doesn't have, the nipples and all that, the other attached accoutrements of true sexuality. But, it has a bunch of naked bodies in it. And it says, everyone's beautiful. It, shows, transgender bodies and things like that. For kids that are, 8 to 9 years old, some of this has to be inappropriate.
Yeah. So, all right, let's back up a little bit, because as always,
we've gone off on a little bit of a
here.
tangent.
All right. So, the one thing I want to make, because we said why religion is important. Well, the one thing that I think we can note right off the bat is it's inescapable. I think one of the best definitions of religion is that to which you are ultimately committed. And we all have an ultimate commitment of some kind. Maybe appropriately that ultimate commitment is God, or maybe it's inappropriately not. Maybe that ultimate commitment is the state, or some type of political ideology, or some other type of obscure philosophy, or maybe it's football. Whatever it is, right? There's no. We have this void that absolutely needs to be filled of an ultimate commitment at all times. So I would say that that's purposeful. That's put there for a reason. Our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee, O Lord, said Saint Augustine. Like, we have this sensus divinitatis that is meant to bring us into a knowledge, however general and confused, a basic knowledge of God. If we deny it, if we try to fight against it, we will put something in its place in form of ultimate commitment. So the question isn't, are you going to be religious or not? You're religious no matter what. The question is, are you going to have the right religion? That's the only question that's worth asking. Even if your religion is that you have no religion, you're just religion is atheism at that point. Congratulations. That is your ultimate commitment. And we certainly can think of no shortage of atheists that behave rather indecently, more indecently than some religious people. And this is by no means to say that religious people don't behave indecently, but let's not pretend like we all don't hold some type of ultimate commitment. So the question then is, do you have good reason and arguments to support your ultimate commitment? Whether that be postmodernism or whatever value system you're imposing in schools. And maybe your value system is to let other people pick their own values, which is a value system. You can't escape these things. It's inevitable. So religion, values, philosophy, you cannot get away from any of them. The question is, are you going to do philosophy well? Are you going to have the right religion and the right values? So it's not a matter of trying to be inclusive and bring all that in. If you are, that's your value system. That is inherently not inclusive of people who say, actually, there's greater merit to certain values than others. So not only, again, talk about performance contradiction. This is something to come up. It's inconsistent all these philosophies. And again, usually it isn't even a commitment to one. Most people, as I hinted earlier, are really walking around with like 12 to 15 different conflicting philosophies jumbling on in their skull like gumballs at all times, selecting whatever one just happens to be useful or pretty or tasteful at the time, rather than adhering to any sort of serious intellectual consistency. It's absurd. It's frightening. It's got me a little bit upset right now, but we're going to work through this, Pete. We're going to, one way or another, we're going to get through the other end.
And I mean, we talked about the true, I guess the best way that we put it together was the buffet that is religious pluralism. And that doesn't have to necessarily just encompass different religions. Like one of my favorite quotes, G.K. Chesterton says, if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in nothing. You will supplant God with something. And
if you don't believe in God, you won't believe in nothing. You'll believe in almost anything, I think is what his quote actually was. And how true it is.
Where Chesterton took that argument is you will replace God with the state. Because, you know, who is providing for you, especially in this world, is where we see a whole lot of worship of the state with welfare programs and things like that.
Yeah, or even, I don't think we have to restrict it to the state. You might replace it with Michael Bolton. Something will go in the God gap, right? If you eschew the appropriate holder of that position. So let's go through that a little bit and back to my, kind of my story, perhaps, and we can dig into yours. You know, when it comes to the religion of well, even, because I went through many phases myself, right? I kind of went stepwise. Many years I would have called myself an atheist, even though I don't think I was ever so much a very militant one. Certainly not one of the new atheists. I always thought the new atheists were very sloppy thinkers. Just I would have been embarrassed to have called myself a Sam Harris fan at any point, and I certainly would still be embarrassed to call myself anything like that now, because I had read the old atheists, right? I had read Russell and Camus and Sartre and Nietzsche and all those people. And their thinking was just so much more clear and consistent, even though I now believe that they were fundamentally wrong on a few key premises. But then I got away from that and moved into kind of an agnosticism, and then I found problems with agnosticism, and I realized, okay, there's something to spirituality. There is something like naturalism cannot be right. And I think that's probably worth talking about even just for a minute, because and this is something somebody on an interview asked me, and why do you take this religious stuff so seriously? What made you consider it in the first place? And I think it's actually we can start with a few basic arguments that most people could agree on. One is that we have a true dilemma on our hands when it comes to reality. There are two fundamentally different viewpoints people can take. It's either A or not A. Either God exists or something like God, or not A. God does not exist. So either we have a view of reality that is supernatural or theistic, one could say. And again, maybe we could squeeze some pantheism in there or something, but so supernatural, we'll say, or naturalistic on the other hand. And it's one or the other. Right. It's you can't be half pregnant with God. Like it's just not an option. Right. So then you just have to think. And this is kind of where it went for me of like, what are the implications of my naturalistic worldview of God not existing? And then I realized there were a series of serious contradictions, absurdities, and incoherencies. You mind if I list a few of these, Pete?
No.
For you? I think it might be helpful. All right. The first, of course, is that as a naturalist, you're forced to be a determinist, right? And for people who are listening, it might be unfamiliar. I'll try and zoom out and give a summary of the philosophy. So naturalism assumes that there's no such person as God or anything like God, right? Nature is all we have. Everything can be reduced to mechanical, physical processes. It is a completely closed and interlocked system of cause and effect. Right. With me so far? Right. Oh, okay. So what does this tell us about the human organism and ourself? Well, it must be the result of, again, this closed interlock system of cause and effect. Imagine a very long string of dominoes, even if it branches out in however many directions, right? The problem with this is that this reduction to the purely physical, mechanical worldview would also include all our beliefs and rationalities. Now, this is, of course, what leads to determinism, meaning that there is no such thing as free will. Anything you believe was could ultimately be linked back to, again, this series of cause and effect of physical processes, however long back in time, maybe eternally, who knows, doesn't matter. But it could, in principle, be traced back.
Right.
That means that
that's what Harris always tries to do.
This is the Harris argument, of course, and he is certainly no pioneer of determinism. He just rehashed some of the worst arguments for it. And I want to be very clear about that. Like, determinism is not a new philosophy. This has been around for a long time. And Harrison, I really believe that Harrison added genuinely, absolutely nothing new to the conversation, like at all.
And yet he's the go-to.
He actually presented some of the weakest possible arguments for it. And would be embarrassed to call myself a Sam Harris fan. Now, so what is this telling us? Well, it tells us that we never chose to believe anything, that the entire enterprise of free will is gone. But think of the implications with this. If free will is gone, then the whole enterprise of rationality is gone as well. Rationality entails that we must have been able to choose otherwise, that there must have been something beyond cause and effect, something like ground and consequent, where we could freely deliberate over options, weigh evidence, and have chosen one way or the other. Determinism says we could never have chosen or the other. It had to be one way. The fact that Harris is a determinist, if I were a determinist, I couldn't really blame him for it because he was determined to be a determinist. He could not have chosen otherwise. Right. And he couldn't blame me for not blaming him for it because I would have been determined to not blame him for it, even though I'm determined to not be a determinist on determinism. You see what I'm getting at? So when Harris then turns around and condemns anybody for being irrational, he doesn't understand that his worldview has eliminated rationality entirely. He's just being a hypocrite.
That's why he gets on stage with Jordan Peterson when they're touring around and just gets eviscerated every time.
Well, I don't know. I don't typically watch those conversations. I feel that they tend to wander around in circles. I'm not the biggest Peterson fan. I think he's philosophically inept in many regards. He may be decent at psychology. Who knows? I'm not even entirely convinced that psychology should have been removed from the realm of pseudoscience to begin with. I'm open to evidence, but I'm a little skeptical. But going back to the position of Harris, he's so quick to rail against people of certain religions being irrational, as if they had any choice in the matter on determinism. So it gets even worse, right? So if determinism is true and naturalism is also true, the only game in town left is evolution, right? Where everything that life somehow mysteriously emerged. And whenever naturalists or materialists use the word emerge, might as well just replace that word with magic. They are conspicuously indifferent.
No, right? You're not wrong with that at all.
Of course I'm not, because whenever they can't explain anything but on principle, like they might say we don't have enough scientific evidence, but most of the time it's a category mistake. They simply use words like emergent or emerge. It's like you might as well use the word magic at that point because you really have no idea what's going on. So forget that there's just no good grasp of any type of scientific theory for abiogenesis. We'll just grant it. All right, whatever sprang up in some pool of goo. That's great. And then random mutation and selection start coming into play. Now, if all of our beliefs are ultimately formed by random selection mutation, there's no reason to assume, at least on face, that any of our beliefs are true. Because why should we think that random mutation and selection, which essentially filters out or filters in, we should say, things that are of survival benefit, that any inherent belief that is select is true? Why would we assume that something has to be true to be of survival benefit? And in fact, we can think of a good example on naturalism where something that the naturalist would say is of great survival benefit but isn't true. And that would be, of course, belief in the existence of God. right? So all the naturalists claim that this is somehow some mutation that arose through the evolutionary process that is a complete delusion, but conferred a survival benefit, therefore admitting that things can get through the evolutionary process that are completely untrue, but helped us to survive at some point.
Right.
Well, same thing with morality. Oh, no, there's no such thing as right and wrong, right? It's just we developed these false beliefs because they were helpful to survive. So now we're stuck with a real problem, right? Because it's hard to determine what sort of probability we have on naturalism for assuming that any of our beliefs are true.
Right.
Maybe it's high, maybe it's very low. We just really can't know, which means any belief in knowledge on the naturalist philosophy should at best be agnostic, if not extremely skeptical.
Right.
So we should not so what I'm ultimately saying is on naturalism, we have no real reason to trust our cognitive faculties of being successfully aimed at truth. But if that is true, especially which they would say it's true of belief in God and morality and other things, then we have no reason to really trust in any of our beliefs, which would include, of course, the belief in naturalism and evolution and everything right down the line. Right. So not only have they eliminated rationality, but they have eliminated the very grounds for holding any sort of reliable belief at all. But then that goes around and would essentially attach itself to the very philosophy that they began to purport at the first place. So these were some of the just absurd inconsistencies that right away I realized, not right away, this took me a while. That's not true. They're like, okay, this worldview has some serious problems to it. And you don't often get into it because, the naturalist atheists, the people like Harris will go around purporting that any theistic belief or whatever of religion is a delusion. It's crazy. It's totally irrational. But that's just them being inconsistent with their philosophy. That is literally, yet again, another performance contradiction to hold to a worldview that eliminates rationality on one hand and then accuse people of being irrational on another hand. It just doesn't make sense. They can't go together.
Well, it's like, argument for – then you get into the argument of self-evident truths, obviously. Like, you should just know this to be true, which is just –
Well, that is the argument against naturalism, and I would say to a degree determinism too. Well, once you blow up naturalism, you're not committed to determinism anymore.
Right.
Obviously, if you hold a theistic view or supernatural view, there is again room for free will. I would argue there's strong scientific evidence for that as well, which especially in the quantum realm has really put determinism in a hard position. But all that aside is we know certain things are true. This is a properly basic belief, which is at direct odds with the naturalistic worldview, which says that we really shouldn't know, or at least reliably know, that anything is true. So there's at least, to say it conservatively, there's at least a tension there. Right. I would say it's probably more than just a tension, but the idea of rationality on one hand and determinism and naturalism on the other hand, they just do not play well together at all. And one could even make the argument that evolution and naturalism really don't play well together at all. If you want to save evolution, you actually would need something like God to help guide the process to ensure that our faculties are reliable.
Right.
So if you want rationality, it seems to me that the only position that you could get rationality out of reliably would be a position that entails some type of designer that would have wanted to make sure that our faculties are something upon which we can rely. Mm-hmm. So there's a epistemological argument being made here that the only really rational view that somebody should hold is a theistic viewpoint or belief in God, because that's the only one that would give us reason to think that our faculties can be trusted, which basically we know that we can. Intuitively, we know, okay, 2 + 2 = 4. Like that is true. Our reasoning is reliable. Like the laws of logic are valid, even if people don't always apply them consistently, right? These are truths of the world. So a little bit of a rant there, Big Pete. Sorry but hopefully you got a good nap in, but I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and I agree with all of it and don't have a whole lot to add.
But I mean, I think it's important again, there's many arguments that you can give for the existence of God and against the problems of materialism, but just epistemologically, when it comes to knowledge and truth, this philosophy is deeply problematic. It is deeply riddled with inconsistencies and ultimately absurdities. And if you're consistent with a philosophy and it leads you to a series of performance contradictions and incoherencies, I think you at least should take a few steps back and track along and see if you made some type of mistake along the way.
Right.
Will people like Sam Harris be doing that anytime soon? Absolutely, virtually not. He's yammered on for however many years now against the irrationality of religious belief. Could you imagine him trying to change his position on it now? He would be devastated, of course, by the mob. He would be mobbed, literally mobbed by his.
Many have tried.
Mobbed by his customers of angry atheists. It reminds me of Anthony Flew, the one, the atheistic philosopher who said he was open to evidence. He debated for many, many years on a prominent level. And then late in his life, he abandoned atheism and came to belief in God. And what did they do? The atheists said, oh, well, he's just going senile. They just went straight for the ad hominem and say he must be losing his mind. He said no. But what actually convinced him were the classic Aristotelian and scholastic arguments like Aristotle, unmoved mover for change, and Aquinas, that he said he just never really seriously considered him before. And then when he did, he realized, okay, these arguments are convincing. So there was somebody who at least seems like, yes, okay, he really was open to the evidence, even if he didn't consider the other side for much later in life. But the reaction so don't tell me that these people aren't religious. That's right. Ultimately what I'm getting at. Like the vitriol that this man received from people that were his followers for so long when he said, you know what, guys, I think I got it wrong. I'm switching sides here. They just tarnished that man. The poor man, I think he was in his 80s or maybe even 90s at this point, 80s, maybe not 90s, drug him through the mud. Poor Anthony Flew just got it up and down. And of course he responded. He's like, no, I'm not insane. You people are insane.
Well, I mean, we talk, there's people try to separate religion from dogma, so to speak. And they always talk about, the God science or the God state or something else to that effect. And like you said, that's a religion unto itself. And you talked about, the absurdities of determinism and naturalism. And I think you got it absolutely right, that it eventually turns back on itself and has to start cannibalizing itself.
Yeah.
But the problem is no one takes the full logical loop like you and me have, being red pilled in our, the first having, the quarter life crisis, so to speak, of, finding religion again.
Yeah. And part of it is I was really trying to be consistent in naturalism and realizing this. And there are some naturalists that will just then go and take a totally agnostic position. But even agnosticism, so people think that like agnosticism is the best thing. Like, okay, epistemically, maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. But here's the problem with agnosticism, right? So atheism, as I use the term, is making the positive claim that God does not exist,
right.
Which means the atheist then has a burden of proof. You have to give me arguments for why you think this is true. And of course, no atheist has ever been able to sustain that burden of proof. The agnostic says, they
get rid of the burden of proof.
I don't know, right? Yeah. Right. So, okay, you don't have a burden of proof, but there is a problem with being an agnostic. And it goes right back to what I was saying before. If you're an agnostic, then you are unsure about how our cognitive faculties developed. Maybe they were designed by an all-powerful, all-loving, benevolent creator. Maybe they were designed by a demonic force. Maybe they arose from some type of weird fungi that smashed into our planet on a comet. Maybe they were spontaneously the result of, random mutation or selection. You don't know. So then, again, what is the probability then on agnosticism that your faculties are reliable? It seems at least very dubious that we should think that they're at all high, right? Of all the things that could be on the playing field for as an agnostic, why should we assume that, again, these faculties that we use, that we intuit are reliable, but we're putting intuition aside for now. We're just looking at the agnostic worldview that our faculties are reliable. It seems that the probability would actually be mediocre at best, but probably low. And I always try to be conservative in this. But if that's the truth, then we, again, would have some type of reason to doubt any of our beliefs, which would then turn right back around and cast doubt on our belief in agnosticism.
Right.
Right? So if you, again, I'm sorry to have to keep pushing this because people get very upset who aren't theists and say, how dare you say the only rational position we can hold? Theism is the only position that can solidly affirm rationality as an enterprise that is reliable. Naturalism can't do it. Agnosticism throws it in doubt as well. If you want to say that you hold a rational position, you need to subscribe to a worldview that would give you reason to believe that your faculty of reason is reliable to begin with. Right. And there's only one worldview that can do that, and that would include some type of design plan, some type of designed worldview where there is intentionality behind these acts, where there is a creator that would want us to have faculties that are, of course, reliable, that are successfully aimed at truth. So you don't even get away with it. People think that agnosticism is an escape hatch. It's actually not.
Right. You put yourself into a more of a ethical and rational quagmire than you think you're getting out of.
The point is that on an agnostic viewpoint, you may have a somewhat higher degree of probability of reliable faculties because you might include that God could be behind it, but it's still not high enough that you shouldn't cast doubt on your beliefs. Right. But of course, agnosticism is a belief. You don't get to arbitrarily draw the line at one belief over another, right?
Right.
If you're agnostic about believing God, you should be agnostic about all beliefs, which would include a belief in your agnosticism.
Right.
So just asking for a little bit more consistency of people's positions here.
Right.
You see it all the time. And I saw an enraged, quivering thread of atheists the other day going about it, and they were going at it with each other about what's better, agnosticism or atheism. And all I could laugh was think about all these things that we're now talking about right now.
Right.
But my goodness. But, these were things that I really grappled with. And so that in turn said, okay, I know that rationality is a reliable enterprise. Of course, we can be justified and hold beliefs that are untrue because we reason from premises that were unsound, right?
Right.
But I know that some basic proper beliefs are absolutely true, that knowledge is something that humans can have. So I, therefore, should probably commit myself or at least investigate worldviews or philosophies that would allow for some type of design plan or cosmic creator or cosmic muffin or polenta loaf, whatever the heck you want to call it at that point, that could allow me to establish the foundations necessary to affirm what I know to be properly basic and true, that truth exists, it is objective, and that humans can come to a knowledge of truth. Right. This is fundamentally obvious. All of us live our lives by this way, and there's no reason that we should deny it. In the same sense, there's no reason we should deny objective morality unless, of course, we have already committed to a worldview that we're going to defend come hell or high water, like naturalism or materialism. But we've already seen the problems with that. So this is just a little bit insight into my journey of how I started to come back to considering the religious position in a very general sense after kind of being driven to a number of very severe, I would say, inconsistencies within the naturalistic, atheistic viewpoint.
Right. And my explanation of kind of how I started to come around a little bit more is a little bit more simpler and a little bit less long-winded.
Sure, people could use the break, Pete. Go right ahead. But, I've got a lot more yet to say.
Oh, I imagine. Anyway, kind of how I eventually made the turn from what I would call spiritualism, which is, that next step away from agnosticism that says, yes, there is a God. I can kind of find him on my own, so to speak. I always had that Catholicism kind of that upbringing in the back of my head, how I should be good because God wants me to go to heaven, and be good because I want to be a good, moral, and upstanding person, basing my morals off of that Catholic upbringing that I had. And God bless my mother. you showed up. My brother succumbed to his heroin addiction and ultimately died. Some real wicked stuff out there now. And, you know, I was in a real dark place, real low in life.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I told my mother, who we mentioned on the program before, the uber Catholic, you know, relics everywhere in the house and, you know, dragging us kicking and screaming to mass every Sunday, you know, 5 sons, God help her. But, you know, I was at an incredibly low place in my life when my brother died. You know, kind of a little bit more on my background. I work in a criminal justice capacity. That's about all, you know, I'm comfortable saying on live air. But
recorded air.
But anyway, I come from a criminal justice background, and we didn't really mesh with him I really didn't mesh with him while he was alive. I kind of treated him as an outsider, so to speak. And I mean, me and Pat have talked on this before, as suffering as a way to come back to God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we talked about that, the soul's upward yearning for God and filling that God void is kind of how I came all the way back around to Catholicism.
Yeah.
You know, I was in my car, you know, going to my brother's funeral with my stereo cranked up to as loud as it would go, and, you know, just screaming it away at bands like Lamb of God and Anthrax, and trying to find, you know, some sliver of meaning. And it would fill me for a time, but then it would go away. And, you know, and I was sitting at my brother's funeral, and my mother picked out the music. I talked about this before. And, you know, I'd always been, you know, someone that I would kind of get down on myself, so to speak, and, you know, look for meaning again. And I was kind of God struck, so to speak, God smacked at my brother's funeral when, you know, we were wheeling him out. Me and my brothers were the pallbearers, you know, obviously just tears streaming down our face. But the song "Be Not Afraid," the refrain says, "Be not afraid, I go before you always. Come follow me and I will give you rest." Mm-hmm. And, you know, that to take it to one experience, you know, I started coming back again and, you know, read a lot of the arguments for God. You know, we talked about my background in the humanities, talking, you know, going to literature, and, you know, I follow Jordan Peterson probably more than you do. And he talks about, you know, Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky as, you know, back when they were writing, Dostoevsky especially takes a position such as, you know, the value of human life with Crime and Punishment, and then tries to debunk that with the character of Raskolnikov. And it was the same thing that he did with the brothers Karamazov with God, especially with the character of Alexei.
Pete, I just want to, because I think you brought up such a significant point that I want to highlight it, and then we can carry on with this, because I would hate for it to be lost, because it's so important. And this was something. This is one of the positions that I held in you know, my atheism. I think there's a certain way to look at it. I think when you're very comfortable in, you know, in the warmth of your chamber of the home, contemplating the evils and suffering of the world, you think, okay, how could God exist if there's so much evil and suffering in the world? And we've talked about that before, that the answer, so, you know, this is one could say the best argument for atheism, where they try to make a positive claim that there's an inconsistency between an all-loving, all-powerful God and the existence of evil. How could these things possibly coexist? And intellectually, it's actually not hard to solve. All you have to do is add an additional premise saying that so long as it's even possible that there could be some greater good achieved by the existence of suffering or evil in the world, there is then no contradiction, right? The problem is solved.
Right.
And of course it's possible, right? We don't even have to explain how or why or any of that. We just have to posit the mere possibility. And to make the argument successful as an atheist, you would have to say that it's impossible, which again, nobody has ever been able to sustain that burden of proof. How would you ever know? You're not omniscient, right? You don't have that. But what you say and your experience is really important, because I think it actually strengthens the theistic position, which says, like God allows and permits evil and suffering so that some greater good can be achieved eventually. And when you're not just, again, contemplating it in an ivory tower as an atheist, but you're actually experiencing suffering on a deep level. Mm-hmm. And I think we have the empirical evidence to support this, that when hard times really do hit people, it actually causes them to reflect. Right. To go inward, and to become to kind of tune up spiritually, so to speak. And you can see how this good is actually. And your example was a prime example of that, where this terrible, terrible thing happened in your life, this absolutely devastating thing. And I think we can all think of examples of this in our life, where it's like at the time we think this is senseless. This is mean. Like, why could this ever happen? How could God ever let this happen? I can think of at least 5 instances in my life where this happened. Mm-hmm. But then looking back, we realize, wow, I didn't see it at the time. I would have never predicted a time, but it actually somehow amazingly, brought me closer to God, or it did something good that I would never have predicted. And there's all the defense we need for the problem of evil. That possibility is clearly there. But I think in our experience, we can all think of where it wasn't just a possibility. It actually happened. And I can think of, again, 2 very close people to me dying that I thought was totally senseless, that moved me in certain directions, made me reconsider different things, and that some greater good I really do believe was achieved out of that, or other hardships in my life. And that's why I wanted to highlight yours is, again, when you're not in the muck of suffering, so to speak, and you're kind of taking this third person perspective, like, oh yeah, evil and suffering. Yeah. How could God allow that? But then you actually experience it, and you realize, wow, okay, this stuff is nasty. But clearly there was some reason that this was allowed to happen in my life. And maybe you don't discover that until after you're dead, right? That's very possible too, because it might not just be for you, the suffering and evil. It could be for generations, however far in the future. But I think we can all think of enough examples. And Pete, I think yours is a great one, where it might have not just been for me, but it definitely was for me as well. Right. And just to the extent that it seemed like it brought your family closer together, and it also caused you to seriously come back to the spiritual side, right? Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, it was to kind of bring just into summation. It kind of makes you question, what is this life for? And how the fragility of life, just, made me do a really deep introspection. And the only place I found any lasting reprieve from this, I mean, we as a family, we still deal with this today. My mom will call me up and, I was sitting in a quiet room and, thinking about John and, just having a hard day, so to speak. And, and it's that little constant reminders, that little, St. Therese talked about this, the little whispers from God, that lead us back in that direction. And some of us, certainly me included, need that sort of, that God smack, that back from the divine, so to speak, to bring us back into the fold. And, I told my mom, I said, I'm not my Catholic mother who put me through, 12 years of parochial education to make me a good Catholic boy. I went up and told her, I think this is true, but I need to find it on my own. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where I delved back into what I was talking about before. I was took me 5 years to get a 4-year degree in the humanities. God help me. but my emphasis was in classical literature, and I had read things like Paradise Lost and, the Canterbury Tales and things like that.
Yeah.
But of course, you're not going to touch, Chesterton's apologetics. And I mean, I got a little bit of C.S. Lewis, but it was a realm of, well, if evil's true, Screw Tape may be right and blah, 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 blah. Anyway.
Which, by the way, if anybody listening has not just torn through the works of Lewis and Chesterton, please go on Amazon, order it.
You can get a copy of the Screw Tape letters used for like 99 cents.
And Screw Tape is so good because it's not only such an entertaining read, but there's so much truth in that. And it's like, it's like, listen, folks, you might not want to hear this, but the devil's real.
Right.
He's out there. And the two best tricks that the devil ever played was, one, getting you to think he didn't exist, and two, getting you to think he's more powerful than he actually is. C.S. Lewis got that. And the Screw Tape letters is so fantastic at that. His problem of pain, one of the best addresses of the problem of evil, like we said. And again, there's two sides of that. There's the intellectual side, which again is not hard to refute, but most people struggle on the emotional side. Right. And that's where his problem of pain and a grief observed were really tremendous works, and I think really helpful. Mere Christianity is obviously a classic. My favorite of his, by the way, is Miracles. And in Miracles, he actually presents a similar argument to that I did before in this, where he shows that, like, look, there's a lot of inherent inconsistencies in being a determinist, right? And does it in an extremely elegant way. The man was so high-minded. I read a biography one time because he had like photographic memory and all this or that. He clearly was a man of genius. Mm-hmm. So definitely that. But so was Chesterton.
Yeah.
Orthodoxy is a tremendous volume. Everlasting Man. So I'm glad you brought these two up, because I think if you are a Christian, or you're considering Christianity, or even just belief in God in general, just like like these guys are, and this was a mistake I made, Pete, and I admitted it to you, is it wasn't until after I became a Christian I even read these people, because I held that like chronological condescension, which we're all guilty of. Like, oh, these guys are old.
Right.
They probably don't have any,
the old dead white guys.
Yeah.
The argument against Shakespeare in university.
Like, I'm sure that they don't have like any good arguments. Sure, it's all been refuted. Turns out, actually, no. They have some of the best arguments you will ever hear then and now. They are not outdated in any sense. I would argue they're more relevant than ever. So don't be an idiot like I was. Go pick this stuff up. Read it now.
And they're not exactly the most ponderous tomes either. You can finish them in a quiet afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just glad you brought those two up in particular. So anyways, continue, was because you came back more through a literary background.
Right. And we, in our times of struggle, we go back to what we know, and I had been reading long, arduous, ponderous tomes for 5 years. So that's really how I found it. And Dostoevsky really turned me around. The arguments of Alyosha and Alexei and brothers Karamazov, which is, they're literally sitting around a table, and Alyosha says, I'm fine with God, but I wish I could have given him back his ticket,
Yeah.
And, it just goes through literally every argument from a naturalism, determinism, in a book that's, it's thick. They say the classic Russian novel from Tolstoy to Chekhov to Dostoevsky, it was traditional, like, hey, this guy, son of this guy, go through the family lines and how everybody's related and how everybody, talks to each other and how everybody feels about each other. The story really doesn't get started till about the 500th page.
Yeah.
But as long as you can wade through that, it's, I've known other people that have read those books, and they're just absolutely life-changing.
Yeah, and I'll admit I have never actually read those. So at some point, someday, I think I'll probably dive in. And I know that Peterson's a big fan and has a lot of good things to say about it. And again, you're right. I'm not a big follower of Peterson. I think a lot of the things he says are true, but I think he needs to get some other things in place to be a little bit more consistent. But I mean, we've danced all over the place at this point, Pete. So I think the big theme here is that, again, religion is not something that can be escaped. Even if you say you're spiritual but not religious, there's your religion, friend. Like you have this piecemeal life force spirituality that you can bring in when it's convenient for you and you need to feel some divine comfort, but that you can cast aside whenever you might be doing something morally indecent. Because
right.
And like how nice that must be.
I feel like being a Sith Lord today.
Yeah, like how nice that be. The life force won't judge me, right? Look, I get it. I've been there. I know the psychology. And nobody said that Christianity is easy to accept. Nobody certainly said that Jesus is easy to accept. But the Jesus that's easy to accept is the Jesus not worth accepting, right? Fundamentally. And that was one thing that I had to reconcile with. And I think this is where Peterson makes a mistake. And I don't think it's a mistake because people have asked him about this before. Somebody did send me an interview where somebody said, what do you kind of use like, the archetypes or whatever. But what do you feel about the Lewis? And this was something that Lewis said, because Lewis subscribed to this view. He thought that Jesus was one of these archetypes or myths. There was actually Tolkien that convinced him, like, no, the archetypes or myths point to Jesus because he's the one that actually came true. He's the myth that actually happened. And when Peterson was pressed on this, he said, you know what? I actually need I think his phrase was like, I need like 3 more years to study that. So he admitted humility on it. And I swear, if he studies it seriously, the historical context like I did, he will be faced with the minimum facts accounts where he'll have to explain, okay, here's the things we know about Jesus. He existed, died, crucified, buried in a private tomb. Tomb was found empty. People and groups experienced appearances of him after his death, which led to the rapid rise of the Christian religion, many of whom went to their deaths proclaiming the resurrection, so on and so forth. How do you explain these facts, right? And then you'll just have to go through the list of all the naturalistic explanations like hallucination and conspiracy theory and realize like all of these are embarrassing failures as far as explanations go. It seems like the only thing that could make sense of this is the one thing that Christians have been telling me all along. This dude actually was who he claimed to be, the Son of God, rose from the dead. That's a very brief summary excursion of the argument.
That's like theology 001.
But I mean that's where you will get a really good book if anybody's interested on this. Like if talk about long, arduous tome by the historian N.T. Wright, and it's about an 800-page masterpiece where he just takes the deepest intellectual dive that you can on Jesus and the facts surrounding his life, death, and of course we would say proposed resurrection, right? And he just goes through here is what the facts of the matter are, and here are all the things that attempt to explain these facts, and just systematically goes through. And then of course he concludes that the only thing that can truly explain this, even on a historical basis, is that the resurrection actually occurred. So can you prove it? Historically, no, but you can prove the events surrounding it and say that the only thing that makes sense of these events and that has the highest plausibility or probability is, of course, this supernatural event, which you have no reason to reject that unless you, of course, have a prior reason to reject miracles to begin with. And I think so that's why when I make the case for Christianity, I have to make it in a 2-step. Right. First off, does God exist? Let's clear that hurdle first. Because if you can get the existence of God, if you can get out of naturalism or atheism, then at least the possibility of a miracle is open. You might still think that miracles don't occur or are very improbable. And of course, I think both of us would agree that miracles are very rare instances. But then you have this rich religious context of this man, this unprecedented man that just made the most radical claims. And then you can not only weigh the historical evidence, but one of my favorite things about looking at the Christian faith and the Christian religion is seeing how it fits within the context of the drama of the human experience itself. And no other religion, philosophy, worldview answers the biggest, most important questions of life so completely and so satisfactorily as the Christian faith. Nothing else can give us such good answers to origin, identity, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where do we come from? Who are we? Why are we here? What is the purpose of all this? How are we supposed to act, and where are we going? No other faith or religion, no other person aside from Jesus can answer these questions so completely that jives not only with our most basic experience, but all the things that we can actually know and observe about the world. Like there is some type of immaterial self or component about us, that we are more than just physical processes, that we can know truth, that our faculties are reliable, that there's a sensus divinitatis within us, that we are reaching for something greater than ourselves. What makes sense of this? Certainly naturalism only makes nonsense of it, right? There's nothing there. So not only can you build a historical case, but if you have the prior background of theism and the philosophical support for God's existence, which I absolutely believe you do, then you have the philosophical evidence, then you can see how does the picture of Christ and Christianity make sense of the drama of human existence?
Right.
And that, to me, is a really interesting thing. And of course, that's an entire episode on its own. But these were the things that I considered along the way. So I'm just sharing a bit of my process. And it was those three pieces: the arguments for God's existence versus the arguments for atheism. Definitely theism absolutely has to be true. Then looking at the historical case for Jesus. Okay, definitely something that can be affirmed rationally, no doubt about it, when you seriously consider it and you really dive into it. And then how does it make sense of our experience? Does it answer the questions that need to be answered? And does it answer them in a way that makes sense? The answer I would say is yeah, it does.
Yeah. Same with me.
Told you I had more to go.
Yeah. I mean, we both found it in vastly different and unique ways, but I think what it really comes down to is, asking those tough questions of ourselves, be willing to both do an introspection and look to, the great thinkers of the world, to that ultimately draw us to Catholicism. And, one of the big arguments against naturalism for me, I was a freshman sitting in a biology class. And of course, biology has to go back to, you talked about, where do we come from? For an argument for Christianity. And if science can come up with no other argument that we came out of some, hot vent in a primordial soup, all of a sudden some cells got together and boom, there was a human being. Seriously?
I mean, where do we begin with this? Well, first off, I think it's like any argument against design from evolution is just a non-starter to begin with, because the teleological argument it actually starts the fine-tuning of the universe, right? That's where you need to have the argument. And it's the discovery of the fine-tuning of the universe that brought the design or teleological philosophy roaring back onto the scene. Right. And so evolution is a non-starter unless you have those infinitesimally finely tuned constants and quantities as initial conditions of the Big Bang, right?
Right.
So, whether or not you think that took care of the whole process, or there needed to be some other additional guidance, or whether along the way is something that I think everybody can remain open to the evidence toward. But it is absolutely insufficient to try and explain away design by evolution at this point.
And, Pope John Paul II, I think, dived into this, thoroughly, with looking at science as opposed to religion. He decided to bring it all together in his encyclical Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, where he talks about, yes, evolution is true, but it has to start somewhere. And isn't it more on us to think that it came from the design, like we were saying, to kind of bring this all together, at least in my thinking? You talked about our faculties being true and our reason leading us to a higher power. And I think that's where John Paul tried to make the argument for, saying that, for our faculties to be true, for us to be reasoning beings and for us to have free will, it has to come from a designer. And if God set these great pieces in motion through his creation, he has to be, like we were talking about, into everything. Things aren't basically made to mate and die,
Well, I think you have to go back, and we'll wrap this up here soon, folks, but if I might just deliver one more blow against the naturalist worldview. Remember, the modern orthodoxy of naturalism and materialism is that, matter is fundamental, and that all matter is inherently mindless, intentionless, purposeless, aimless, all these things. So you have to somehow believe that all this mindless, purposeless, intentionless, aimless stuff somehow assembled through however complex number of series of quantitative steps to produce such a qualitative state that is fundamentally the opposite of everything that you just described, that has purpose, intentionality, aims, directions, beliefs, concepts. It is so qualitatively and fundamentally different than what you describe that this should come from. A simple analogy, it would be something like this. It would be, and this is even more probable than what I just outlined, would be imagining that you could build a white tower if you just had enough black blocks, right? It doesn't matter how many black blocks you have. There is an incommensurable qualitative abyss that needs to be crossed that in principle does not seem like it can be crossed by your orthodoxy.
Right.
So, I mean, this is a conversation that we can reserve for an episode fully on philosophy of mind. But I mean, just our fundamental experience of consciousness, of quality, of what it is like to have our experiences, to have awareness of self, is just so wholly inexplicable or irreducible to pure physical processes. Of course, so this is why I'm fond of philosophers of mine who are materialists. This is why I like the eliminativists, right? Have you heard me talk about them before? I like the eliminativists because they tend to be consistent even though they're incoherent. So they realize that it's really difficult, if not impossible, to explain consciousness on naturalism or materialism, that their best solution is just to ignore that it exists at all. They just say that it's an illusion, right? Well, it only invites the question, well, who exactly is having this illusion, Mr. Eliminativist? Sorry. So there's again, like you talk about a babyish philosophy. There is a difference, believe it or not, between solving a problem and ignoring it. Right. Ignoring a problem is not solving it. But the eliminativists are very telling because it just shows how incompatible so much of our fundamental experience in existence really is with the materialist, naturalistic paradigm. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We could go on about this problem forever. Now, obviously, consciousness is not hard to explain on the theistic worldview at all. There might be certain elements about it that are very mysterious, but in principle, it's not hard to explain. Obviously, we're made in the image of God, and if you have mind before matter, it's not hard to figure out how you could get mind from matter. If you have matter before mind, it becomes almost inconceivable of how you could get mind from matter, right? But I don't know. I think we've punctured a few holes, and hopefully in the materialist, naturalistic worldview, it's something that I've not only honestly come to the conviction that it just cannot possibly be true, but is really a philosophy of just wild fantasy. Go back to the word emergent, right? Which here we go, we'll round it out with emergent, right? Like, what do philosophers find to say that consciousness is just some mysterious emergent property? Again, if you really read into the literature and study stuff, you might as well just replace emergent with the word magic at any point.
It would make sense.
It would just be the same thing. You just can't throw the word emergent on something that you have no ability to explain and think that your philosophy should be taken seriously. I'm sorry. So I don't know. So look, folks, here's the deal. Religion's inescapable. Everybody has some type of ultimate commitment. It's worth spending the time to get your religion right. Listen to the arguments. Commit yourself to truth. Again, it's not the person who has doubts that I'm worried about. I tell this person all the time. So I posted on my Facebook wall thread saying I'm having serious doubts and this or that. I said, don't worry, dude. You're a smart guy. You're going to figure it out. The person with doubts I'm not worried about. That's because you're going to seek. You're going to find the truth. Study, have faith, pray. You'll come to it. It's the person of absolute, utter conviction who never thinks that they could possibly be wrong at all. That's the person I'm probably more worried about. And that goes on either side, theistic or atheistic. Now, I just said that I'm convinced that I really don't believe that anything like materialism could possibly be true. Am I absolutely positively convinced of everything I believe? I would say I'm very solid and comfortable in my knowledge now. But of course we have doubts. We all have doubts. That's a perfect normal part of the process. The point of being a Christian or a person of religion is not to live with any doubts or to live with unanswered or to have to answer every single question, but to learn to have the solid foundation that you need to establish your religion and to learn to live with the fact that you're just not going to be able to answer every question about life and reality in a single finite lifespan. That's just it. But I do think one more thing, and then we'll let you finish this up, Pete. The greatest tragedy in life, I think, and this is something that really agitates me now when I hear the atheistic materialist people say, like, why questions aren't important. The greatest tragedy in life would for there to be some great meaning behind life, for God to exist and have a great purpose for your life and the life of everybody of those around you, and for you to miss that. Right. Because you weren't seriously willing to consider the arguments and to consider the value in religion. So forget all the societal impacts, which I know we brought up at the start. We'll save that for another episode. I'm talking about you right now. The greatest tragedy in life would be if God exists and he has a plan for you and you somehow missed it. That to me would be, and somebody presented this to me, somewhere along my journey, and it kind of shook me, it jarred me a little bit. So I'm just going to throw it out there because if nothing else, and that's not proof, of course, that any of this is true, but just think of that, right? Like, to me, that does seem like the potential greatest tragedy, like that there was some objective meaning to your life, but for whatever reason, you didn't take the time to even see if it was a possibility, and you missed it. Don't let that happen. Pete, fill in the blanks here.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've talked before, and kind of where you were going with this, is, in our Catholicism and in religion itself, there's so much power in the surrender to an outside force's will. We talked before about, the concept in the Our Father of, thy will be done. I can't know it all. Mm-hmm. Even though we talked about, our rationality leading us to a higher power, leading us to God, that rationality is however limited. And we need that sensus divinitatis, like you talked about, that upward seeking of God to help us answer those questions, and also for us to be able to say to ourselves, to surrender, to say, I can't know it all and I can't do it on my own. That seeking of, divinity in ourselves has become such a quagmire, such a swamp of an argument that it's, led to a lot of horrible things happening in the world, from, the Calvinists trying to set up their utopian societies to Mao and Hitler declaring themselves, the state is God and, I'm Jesus Christ, essentially, come to save you from all your sins. And, we saw really where that can lead us, and the naturalist point that we've shoved holes into. We talked about, Christianity gives us all the things that we need, and Christ really came to be the everyman's solution to, this overarching concept of not knowing God and not knowing God's plan for us.
And to that, Pete, I would say amen. There's a million other things we could go on to continue to discuss, but I think we've set the foundation here. So we're gonna wrap it up there.
Yep, sounds good.
All right, my friend. Thank you for joining me. Folks, if you're new to the podcast, please hit subscribe and leave a ranking on iTunes. That is, of course, the best way to support the show, to bring new folks into the fold. So if you found this conversation helpful, useful, interesting, or entertaining in any way, please do us a solid. Hit subscribe either on iTunes or Stitcher. Leave a ranking and a review, and it would be deeply and greatly appreciated. Thank you, and catch you next time.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.